All right. So in the bottom of the left inside of your program is our 2018 daily affirmation. Let's read it together like we mean it. Ready? Yes. All right, here we go. Today is a brand new day. I refuse to limit my life by any past experience. I was born to be happy, to be abundantly supplied with every good thing, to have fun in living, to grow, and to consciously align the power within me with the divine power around me. I boldly claim my birthright. Today is the best day ever. And so it is. All right. So, this is today's talk. We have balloons and balls and more to be revealed. I want to say just a quick thing about this morning's reading. Ernest Holmes, depending on which historian is talking about it, was influenced, 25 to 50% of Ernest Holmes' writings were influenced by Judge Thomas Troward. And Thomas Troward identified that we don't create nothing. He referred to us as divine distributors of creation. That creation happened one time and it's continuous. That there's nothing new being created, but rather new manifestations of creation that already exists being brought into form. Which, interestingly enough, is being borne out scientifically in what we're learning from quantum physics. That everything already exists in this amazing field of infinite possibility. And that thought, the observer, observing out of that field of possibility through a mental equivalent, which Ernest Holmes talks about, collapses that energy into form. Interestingly enough, and I got somebody that asked for a talk on quantum mechanics, and I'm working on it. But the short version, the chair you're sitting in is not solid. Just so you know. There are no two molecules in that chair touching. It's a trip. And everything that we think is sitting still is actually moving imperceptibly slowly, but everything is in motion. Take that with you for the day. Everything you look at, it's like, really? Not solid. Okay. I know, it messed with me for a long time. Some days it still does. So today we're talking about consciousness and being rooted in the divine. So everything we could possibly need, we were born with. It's already in us. The challenge is, how do we access it? How do we live in this world that says we're separate and live a conscious practice of oneness? Because in oneness, there ain't no separation, because separation requires at least two-ness. And so if there's really only one, there can't be any separation. So we know from that place that we belong to each other. That what I think and what I hold in consciousness impacts you, and what you think and hold in consciousness impacts everybody too. It's a huge responsibility when we really step into that, which I think is probably the biggest barrier to Centers for Spiritual Living being overwhelmed with bodies in our centers, because it requires responsibility. And as humans, we're not so good at that. You know, here, let me give you my responsibility. Thank you very much. Now I don't have to deal with that. We like giving our power away until you don't do with it what I think you were going to do with it. Then I'm going to take my power back and give it to somebody else. The real healing is when I stand on the authority of my power, no matter what you think, no matter how you react, whether you play with me or not, becomes inconsequential. Because when we really know what's alive in us, when we get really clear why we exist, it won't matter what anybody else thinks. When you know that divine spirit, God, whatever label you want to put on it, smiled you into being so it could know itself as you, when you get clear about that, you ain't going to care what anybody else thinks. You're going to be about the business of being that in a way that is uncompromising and loud and out here and celebratory. And in the meantime, we live on planet Earth. So I watched a video. My whole talk completely changed yesterday. It's like I had this whole thing, weeks worth, and then I watched one little YouTube video. And it all flipped. But it flipped in a really cool way. So what came to me as I was watching this video, so I had to run out to the dollar store, is that our consciousness is a lot like a balloon. And I got polka dotted balloons on purpose because this is like all of the thoughts of humanity that are on my consciousness. They're not actually in my consciousness unless I put them there, but they're on my consciousness. They're, like fleas everywhere. And they hop around and they annoy us and they distract us. So imagine, if you will, this is your consciousness. And all these little dots are the thoughts of humanity. Now, as we do our work, we become aware at some level of a divine idea in the mind of the infinite that nudges us to be more than we think we can be. Now, that might be a little challenging for us to get that into our consciousness. So you're just tootling along, and all of a sudden, the divine says, I want you to be this big. And you're looking at your consciousness going, how do I get that in there? How do I get this idea of the divine into my consciousness? Well, you got to stretch. We got to stretch a lot sometimes. And as we stretch, lo and behold, in it goes. And so it's in there, but now I can't see it. I know it's in there, so I know it's in my consciousness. And a lot of us want to stop there. It's like, okay, it's in my consciousness. The magic is going to happen. Well, it's not going to happen without your participation. And so in order to have some clarity, we might need to expand our consciousness. And so we do some spiritual practice that expands our consciousness. It's like, okay, well, now I can hear it a little better. And I can, it's fuzzy. Let me expand my consciousness some more. And it begins to be more clear. Now, notice, at the same time, the human conscious thoughts, the race conscious thoughts that are on my consciousness are getting bigger and more pronounced and becoming a greater distraction. Okay? Because really, That's how it happens. Who knew the gospel according to balloons would have such wisdom? And so we continue to grow and we study and we expand our consciousness some more. And it begins to actually get clear, and it begins to drop down in a place where it begins to manifest. But how do we deliver this divine idea? Now, many of us, and this came out of a pregnancy video. Some of you will recognize this. And toward the end of pregnancy, before delivery actually starts, there's these things called Braxton Hicks contractions. But Braxton Hicks contractions come from down here. And notice they don't really do a thing to move this gift into birthing. Those contractions come from the top, the heart contractions. So what came to me was that's the higher consciousness. That we have to operate on birthing this idea from a higher consciousness. And it's going to be uncomfortable, and there's pressure. And so we begin to exercise that, and it begins to move. And it gets closer. And what happens with a lot of us, and I'm guilty of this myself, is that we see it moving down, we see it, it's getting close, and we jump down here and want to hurry up the process, and what happens? Goes right back up. Because instead of operating in the divine consciousness, instead of cooperating with the divine for its creation, I suddenly thought I was in charge. Okay. If you're familiar with the kingdoms of consciousness, kingdom 1 is victimhood, life is happening to me. Kingdom 2, I'm in charge, I'm doing it. That's that place where we think we're creating. We're not. Kingdom 3 is the divine is creating through me. And Kingdom 4 is the divine is creating as me. And so when we really get that all of this is the divine, and we're willing to really work, to do our work in consciousness, not down here in the hurry up, but to wait and let it do its thing, we don't have to even look. We don't have to stress. But notice we change. Notice our shape changes as we do this work. And the dots, the stuff that's on our consciousness, gets smaller and less of a distraction because we're focused at the top. And we keep going, and we keep going, and we keep going. And then when we least expect it, our divine idea is birthed. Now that's really cool for a small idea. But what happens when the divine says, I got something huge for you to birth? Then what happens? Because I'm just saying, birthing this, little different than birthing this. You know, this is our nice 6.2 pound. And this is our 10 point whatever pound. The women in the room know what I'm talking about. So now we have a dilemma. Because if I struggled to get this in my consciousness, how in the world am I going to wrap my consciousness around something this big? When the divine calls you to show up in a way that makes you want to run, that's this. And that's a beautiful thing. And no, without condemnation, you're a choice. You can run, you can go, thank you very much, I'm good with my consciousness. Thanks for the idea. No, thank you. You get to do that if you want. Or you can figure out how to stretch. And you can begin. It's like, okay, how do I do this? Because really, I've stretched as far as I can go. It's not going in there. Okay? So I have to begin to make friends with it. And little by little, I work around it. And I get to be friends with it. And all of a sudden, there it is, in my consciousness. But then I look at it and I go, how am I going to grow my consciousness? Because now there's a big block. Because oftentimes that's what it feels like. It's like this enormous thing that I'm supposed to be that I can barely wrap my mind around. And yet I'm supposed to expand my consciousness big enough to birth this thing. Here's what I want you to get. Your breath is the breath of the divine. And it would not, could not give you an idea that is too big for you to manifest. It looks like that's really tight and there's no room. But if I try, air gets in. Because the air of the divine is already in here. I'm not adding anything that doesn't already exist. I'm expanding what's already there. And because it's all God, all one, it cannot be against itself. So there's no way that you're going to get an idea of the divine as you that's too big for you. It's not going to happen. Now, might you have to expand your consciousness a bit more to birth a bigger idea? Probably. Let's see. And that's a little heavier to hold because it's bigger. And how often do we equate heaviness with negativity? And maybe it's not negative. Maybe it's just a really large idea because that which created you knows the capacity it installed within you that you haven't caught on to yet. And so it is calling you to know yourself by calling you to know it. And so we expand. And there it is. But notice, even though it rolls around and it bends a little bit, it's not breaking anything. It's not damaging a thing. And we expand some more. And again, same phenomenon. I don't care how many of these I blow up. When consciousness expands, all that stuff that's on our mind expands too. Okay? Get used to that. Embrace that. It ain't a bad thing. It's just a thing. Okay? And we expand some more. Now notice, at the top of our consciousness, the things of a human are still pretty small. It's on the sides that they distract us. Ernest Holmes called us to be open at the top, not at the sides. You know why he said that? Because it's really easy to get intellectual about our teachings and to make them bigger this way The call is to make them bigger this way. To really nurture that I-thou relationship that only you are privy to. That relationship in your prayer work. That relationship in your meditation work. That relationship when you go for a walk in the woods, in nature, if that's where you find your greatest connection with the divine, and you get downloads, when you get awarenesses that you don't even know where they came from. Okay? That's exactly where they're coming from. And so we begin to work with this. And clearly, it takes more pressure to move it. So I might feel a little more pressured in my consciousness and in the work I'm doing. And so it might be a good idea if I know I'm being called to something bigger than I think I am. I'll use ministry for an example, because I got to tell you, prior to ministry, that's about my conscious work. I just dealt with the dots. I just had enough consciousness to go, oh, that's on the, that's on my consciousness. Let me get rid of that. And I thought the way to do that was to not focus on them, and I actually rendered myself less conscious. Okay? Because I wasn't expanding my consciousness. Because I know I'm expanding my consciousness when I'm more aware of what's happening in the world around me. Because I'm paying attention in a different way. Now, it doesn't mean I have to do anything other than be aware and operate in consciousness. And so I continue to work at the top and be conscious at the top. And as I'm conscious at the top, movement happens. Movement happens. And the shape of me changes. How I show up in the world is a little bit different now, because I'm birthing an idea bigger than what I understood myself to be. Now, again, I can run down here and get in the ego, and what happens? The growth stops, because I think I'm doing it, and I'm not. But it doesn't matter how big you're birthing. I promise you, if you keep working at the top of your consciousness, if you keep increasing your spiritual practice, if you increase your study, if you increase your giving, bada bing, bada boom, you birth a magnificent idea of the divine. Let's take this into prayer. How good it is to know that I am in the company of the One, the infinite. How good it is to stand in the humor of the divine, the imagination of the divine. To yield to that and allow it to inform each of us today of the magnificence that lies within each and every one of us as that. And so knowing the perfection of divinity itself, knowing the wholeness of spirit, knowing the love of spirit, the magnificence of spirit, and knowing that it is the only thing there is, I know with equal certainty that it is the life of all life. That it is the only thing present, and it is here in the individualized form and expression, knowing itself as each and every one of us. And so in that truth, what must be equally true is that there are great things born within each and every one of us, waiting to manifest as us, waiting for our consciousness to expand, to allow that to drop into a place where it can be birthed, inviting us to expand and to work ever increasingly at the top, knowing that there's no struggle at the bottom, that that's handled, that the divine is birthing itself, and we are simply saying yes to being a channel, to being a divine distributor of creation. Grateful for this opportunity to play with the divine, to surrender that pride in my head that says, you look like a fool, and just enjoy. Grateful for how my heart has expanded as I say yes. And so it is from this place of gratitude that I release my word into that divine activity of the law that always, always says yes, always makes it so. And I invite you to make this your own as we say together, and so it is.